Thank you. It's very nice to be here. I need to do a couple of technical things to change from Jay's slides to mine, so if you'll bear with me for just a minute. Does that look like my title? Yes. I'm very excited to be here, and I have to tell you, seeing the weather today, I expected no one to be here tonight. And the fact that there are so many of you is heartening and encouraging, and thinking that there must not be anything good on television, so I'm really happy that you're here. I have to apologize for all the wiring here. Apparently they have different microphones for different tasks, so you'll have to bear with me that I look like I'm about to be electrocuted here a little bit. I'm going to talk tonight about what to me is one of the most interesting things in the world, and that is the human brain and how the brain works and how we learn. But what I'd like to do at the start of this is redefine what I mean by learning. Typically, I think when all of us go to school, or we watch a lecture, or we watch something interesting on television, what we think about as learning is primarily remembering what we've seen, or remembering what we've been told, or remembering what we've been shown. I'd like to change that definition of learning and make it a little deeper than that, and say that learning really occurs when we are changed in some way that allows us to do things that we weren't able to do before the learning experience. Now, I have to tell you, all of us who've been to school, and everyone, as I look around the audience, are in different stages of schooling right now. I know there are many teachers here who teach in the public schools of Austin. I know some of my colleagues are here from the university. And many of us have been in school for a very long time. We were happy students in school, and we were such happy students, we decided we would never leave school. We're still in school. And I remember my own experience as a graduate student when I finally realized that if I stayed at the university long enough, they would start to pay me. So I thought that was a wonderful thing. And I'm still here. But one of the things that I think most of us experience when we go to school is we find our learning experiences much like what's happening right now in this room. And that's all of you are sitting fairly still in seats, listening to someone like me talk to you. And this is described often as a learning experience. Now, I'm going to make a bold statement. As you're in this room, between now and 8:15 or whenever this thing wraps up, none of you is going to learn anything. What you're going to do is you're going to hear a lot of things that I have to say. You might even remember some things that I say. But the learning won't start until you begin to try to apply what you've heard and remembered in experiences outside of this room. Now, for those of you who are teachers, that's a dramatically different way to think about learning. And the reason that that's such an important thing is that all of us in this room have had a wide range of learning experiences, some of which have been inspiring and thrilling and interesting, and some of them have not been. And those experiences are not unique to any of us. I mean, we all have those kinds of experiences. And the talk that I'm going to give to you tonight, as Jay and Shelley alluded to, for about the past 9 or maybe even 10 or 11 years, I've given the opening talk on teaching to the new faculty at the University of Texas at Austin in the fall. And that room that I'm speaking to has a crowd of about 120 people in it. All of them have terminal degrees in whatever their discipline happens to be. Some of them have had teaching positions at another institution before they've come to the University of Texas. Some of them, they're right out of a postdoc or a PhD, and this is their first college teaching job. And I have a very audacious goal when I meet with them. And that is to change the way they think about what it means to learn. Typically, when we work with people who were preparing to be teachers, the focus of attention is on how to teach them how to teach, which is understandable. I mean, you teach somebody to do anything, you focus on the task that the doer is going to do. But what I'd like to invite you to think about tonight is a different way of considering that. And that is thinking about teaching from the perspective of how learners learn. Now, that may seem like ivory tower hair splitting and a distinction without a difference. I assure you, it's not. It is a very important distinction. Because typically, when we watch teachers teach, and we as teachers do whatever it is that we're doing, we're basically evaluating the effectiveness of what we're doing, often based on what we're doing to the students or with the students. And I hope by the end of the talk this evening, you will have flipped that around and change your thinking in a way that the evaluation of teaching, the real evaluation of the effectiveness of teaching, whether it has to do with an individual teacher or an institution or a program or whatever it is, doesn't have to do so much with what the teacher does, but the way the students change in what they do. I'm going to begin by showing you a little film clip. Many of you who watch Division I sports on television know that every university, the University included, has little short clips that promote the university and advertise the university. And I'm going to show you one of my favorite ones from the University of Texas. We're going to do sort of a low-tech, high-tech thing because even though this is a very jazzy room with lots of great equipment, there aren't enough cords to make the sound come out of my computer. So I'm going to take this microphone off and lay it on my speaker. Oh, I just realized there's one thing I want to show you, but before that, I know Robert Moore, this very nice guy who set all this up, is the tech guy. This is the picture he chose for my talk. And I assure you, that's the picture of how we don't. So I figured we need to see an alternative to this, so I like this picture much better. Okay, now, as I said, here's the clip of the university ad.
We don't claim to be able to change the world. We just change people. And then they change the world. We're Texas.
Now, who would want to go to school here? I mean, really. Walter Cronkite steel guitar. Now, that's a pretty audacious statement, too. We change people. Now, I often ask myself and my colleagues the question, well, how do we know that? We put people in rooms like this and we do stuff to them. We talk to them, we have them do assignments, we have them turn things in. But what's our evidence? What's our dependent measure that we've actually changed people? And that's what I'd like to promote tonight as an idea of what real learning and teaching involves, is changing people. Now, you might say, in a very narrow way, well, if you remember something that you've been shown, technically you've been changed a little bit. But what we're all about, at least in the abstract, when we're talking about our broad-minded goals for education in general, we're talking about changing the way people think and reason and problem solve. And that's what I'd like to focus on tonight, is how we actually go about doing that. Now, in order to do that, I'm going to say some things that some of you will find disturbing and uncomfortable. So here's one of my sayings to remember if you're a learner. If you're a learner and you're not uncomfortable during the learning process, you're probably not learning. I often have a chance to meet freshmen who are coming to the University of Texas at Austin, and they're eager and ready to go and happy to be here and still a little bit anxious. And I invite all of them and hope that all of them will have an uncomfortable 4 years of English. Because I promise you, if you're sitting in a classroom and you're listening to somebody give a talk, and what you're thinking about is, yeah, that's right, I knew that, sounds right to me. Yeah, that's true, yeah, I knew that too. You're not learning anything. Right? When you're learning something is when you actually have to confront dissonances between the ideas that are in your head and different ideas with which you're presented while you learn. I'm going to show you a slide that isn't happy for me. It's a list of some of my least favorite questions to be asked by undergraduates. The last one is my least favorite. No, we just goof around. That's the better thing. Now, I gotta tell you, children don't come from the factory asking questions like that. That's not a genetic predisposition up there. People learn to ask questions like that because asking questions like that is an adaptive response. If what you're trying to do as a learner is use your time efficiently, one way to figure out how to do that better is to ask questions like that. But let me translate some of those questions for you in more precise language. So when somebody says, how long does this paper need to be? The precise language of that question is, Dr. Duke, how short could I possibly make this paper? Get the grade that I want in this class. Right? So basically, what these questions promote is how Was students in the sort of economic model as students as consumers coming to a business and they're the consumers and we're the service providers. And I think it's a terrible model for education. Because typically, when you're in that kind of relationship with somebody, the relationship is inherently adversarial, right? You're trying to get as much out of the other party as you possibly can, giving as little back as you possibly can. That's not the way learning happens, right? Teachers, parents, children, learners, everyone need to have a unified sense of purpose about what we're trying to accomplish when we're all in the room at the same time. And that accomplishment, I would argue, has to be predicated on making substantive changes in the way learners think. And I'm including in my definition of learners the very smallest children to graduate students who have been in school for a very, very long time. My first contractual teaching job was in a high school in Atlanta where I was the band and orchestra director. It was a terrific job. I loved it. And I found out shortly after I had arrived that the elementary school whose campus was adjoining my high school's campus didn't have enough music teacher hours for the kindergarten and first graders to have music class. So I, being a new teacher and naive and stupid, said, well, I got a planning period. I'll just, all the teachers just went nuts when I said that. I'll just go over there, during my planning period, and I'll teach music in K and 1, right? So I put my stuff on a cart, because the music teacher was in the music room, and I had, a record player, remember records are like CDs, but really big. Percussion instruments and a guitar, and I'd wheel this cart into a room, and some kids would be doing, worksheets or something, and they'd see me come in and say, oh, God, it's time for music, great, I said, what do you want to do? You want to sing? Yeah, let's sing. Because my put on some music, yeah, put on some Beethoven, yeah, he's good. I mean, they were uninhibitedly, undiscriminatedly positive about whatever I wanted to do. And those of you who have the privilege of being around young children that age know what it's like to revel in their unbridled enthusiasm. Right? Now, with those same children, I can pose a question to the class and say, I'd like someone to raise your hand so you can tell me what's up. Oh, here was here one. There I was going to ask. Now, that was many years ago. And those very same children who I knew when they were 5 and 6 years old have now grown up into young adulthood. And they've become my stressed, oppressed, very anxious doctoral students. And now I can sit around a seminar table and say, I just want to talk to you for a minute. Everybody looks down. And they look like they're taking copious notes. I know they're thinking, God, don't call on me. What happened to you? What took this bright, eager, open, with it, pick me, I'll try, yes, I'll do it person, and turn them into that? And the only common variable that I can think ran through all their past experiences is they all went to school. Now, I gotta tell you, no one in school sets out to do that to people. None of us who entered the teaching profession said, man, I can't wait to get in there and create some anxiety. But yet, we do that very effectively, absolutely unintentionally, but very systematically. And what I'd like to talk about a little bit tonight is how we do that and how we might do that differently. And doing it differently starts with this phrase. It's the favorite phrase I ever composed. And I've always asked people, if someone else wrote this before I did, tell me what it is so I can cite it and no one ever has, so I'm going to take credit for this. I would suggest that every bit of instruction, irrespective of the level, irrespective of the discipline, irrespective of how much time you have to complete the instruction that you're going to put forward to children or adults or whoever it is, should start with that, a vision of students as a complement. And what I mean by that is a clear, vivid, crystalline image of what learners are going to be like when we're finished with that. Now, that may be at the end of today's lesson. It might be at the end of this 6 weeks grading period. It might be at the end of the semester. It might be at the end of their high school education. It might be at the end of their doctoral program. But all of that has to start with clearly, on the part of the teacher, understanding what do we want people to be like when we're finished with that. Now you notice I'm saying what they'll be like and not what they'll know. Because all of us in this room who are old enough to know better know educated person means more than just knowing stuff, right? It's not just we know a lot of stuff. We think in ways that are productive in solving problems and accomplishing tasks and figuring things out. So I wrote down a list of adjectives that describe some of my favorite students. I mean, all of us would love rooms full of people like this. And all of you who are still in school, I see a lot of younger people here, if you write down that list and act like that every day, the teacher will like you a lot. So, now, again, I reject out of hand the notion that children come from the factory like this. Children learn to be tenacious, or they don't. And they learn to be meticulous about their work, or they don't. And they learn to be thoughtful. I mean, not just considerate thoughtful, but thinking thoughtful. Or they don't. And whether they do or not has every bit as much to do with the experiences they encounter when they walk into a classroom as it does with anything inherent to the children themselves. Now, you all know who teach in public school that if you stand out in the hallway right before a class change and the bell rings, you can see people sitting in a classroom, responsible, working hard, writing, following what the teacher's saying. Bell rings, kids go out in the hall, pandemonium. Bell rings again, kids go into another classroom, but this time not quite as attentive and not quite in their seats so much, and a little bit more off task than they were in the classroom before. They're the same children, and it's just 10 minutes later. So it's not just them, right? Now, this is not to say that learners don't bring a lot to a learning experience. I mean, certainly that's undeniably true. But the learning experience itself and the kinds of experiences that learners have, regardless of their age or their level of expertise, influences how all of that stuff happens or doesn't happen in the classroom. When I first came to Texas, it was in 1985, and Texas at that time, and many of the teachers in the room will remember this, was in the process of developing a statewide systematic teacher evaluation system for primary and secondary school teachers. It was called the Texas Teacher Appraisal System. It mattered because there was actually money attached to it. It mattered because if teachers scored well on the Texas Teacher Appraisal System, they would have dollars added to their salaries based on the career ladder that was then in place before they ran out of money. What was interesting to me, I was on some early consultative planning committee of this thing, and at the time there were probably 18 to 20 states who had already had systematic teacher evaluation systems in their states. And so I was in this little committee meeting, and I was new to Texas. Remember, it was 1985, I've been here just a couple of months. And I said, well, why don't we go look at some of the other states and see what they've done? Forgetting that I was in Texas. And the people looked at me and said, well, other states? Well, we're going to consult Rhode Island? What are you talking about? We're going to figure out our own thing. So I prevailed on them to allow me to nevertheless go and look at what other states had done when they evaluated public school teachers. And it's not going to surprise you, all of you who have been teachers for any length of time will recognize that basically when teachers get evaluated, that's the stuff that they get evaluated on. Now, the language might change from assessment to assessment, the organization might, but basically, when people evaluate teachers, that's the stuff that gets evaluated. Now, oops, I didn't do that. Now, my question to you is, which of those 6 things, when teachers are evaluated, do you think gets the least attention?
Knowledge.
Okay, and I hear people saying different things, and I promise you that there are at least 10 advocates for every bullet point. But actually, the correct answer is the first one. Knowledge of subject matter. If somebody says, you have a degree in mathematics? Okay, check, let's go look at your learning environment. Now, I have a daunting truth to lay on you, for those of you who are not yet degree people. One can go through a 4 or 5 or 6-year undergraduate education, pass all of your classes, even with very good grades, get your degree, walk across the stage, wear your funny hat, do the whole thing, get a job, and not really understand your subject that well. Now, that may seem ridiculous, because goodness, I've taken all these credit hours of courses, I've passed all these examinations, I've done all these tasks. How could I not really understand the subject that well? And I'm about to show you that. One of the hardest things about teaching is that you're teaching things that you generally know a lot about, and so it's hard to imagine what it's like not to know what you know. I mean, all of us in this room who are expert at anything are so good at it, and our ways of thinking have become so habituated that many of our ways of thinking we now have come to believe are innate aspects of human cognition. When in fact, we practice thinking that way over a long period of time. But what started out as being very explicit and very deliberate and very well thought out became less and less and less so, and more implicit and automatized, until now we just do it. So one of the hardest things about teaching anything well is being able to think about the subject matter from outside your own expertise. Many of you who I see are my contemporaries in age will remember the time when we were first introduced to desktop computing in the late 70s and early 80s. I mean, what a marvelous thing. The idea that you could have your own computer, like in your office, on your desk. But what all of us realized when we got our first computers, that the manuals written for those first computers were written by evil. Because they omitted critical pieces of information that you needed to get the darn thing to light up. You get your computer, you put the box on your desk, you open it up, you take out the manual. It says, step 1, boot the system. It's in the box, you know? Now, of course, you have to have the CPU plugged into the wall. And of course, you have to have the monitor plugged into the CPU. And of course, is something happening? Thank you. You know, you should wear a little black shirt and kind of run really low like they do in the rock show. Okay. We'll edit all this out later. Am I still there? Okay. So I'm going to start back about 10 minutes ago. Believe it or not, I have remembered my train of thought. But, so when you have that thing, how could somebody write as the first step, boot the system? And the answer is, for that person who wrote that manual, booting the system is that person's first conscious thought. Right? Of course everything's plugged in. Of course the floppy drive goes in with the notch on the right. Of course the lever goes down. Of course that red light's supposed to be on. Of course it's supposed to be making that whirring sound, unless you don't know any of that. Right? Then you don't know. Now, as a teacher, it's understandable how, when we've become so habituated to many of those ideas, and we're looking at somebody thinking that we've told them everything they should need to know to accomplish the thing we've just put forth to them, you know, why haven't you been paying attention? And typically, our first strategy is to repeat the thing that we said already, maybe louder. Right? But the thing I'd like you to consider about that, though, is why would that perpetuate? You know, why would we not see, as a teacher, why would we not recognize that that instruction is not adequate? And the answer is, we have a diversity of people in front of us as our students. And when we give that sparse, surfacey, inadequate explanation, there's somebody in the room who actually accomplishes the task. And we look at that person and say, hey, I'm teaching. Look at that. She can do it, right? And all the other people who aren't doing it, we think, well, what's wrong with you? Maybe you're in the wrong section. You shouldn't be in this class. So, and that's an understandable thing about human behavior, right? I mean, when someone asks me about our program in the Butler School of Music, I talk about my brightest, most with it, talented, insightful, fantastic students. Who, by the way, who were bright and talented and insightful and fantastic when they got here, but I like to take credit for them, right? And I don't mention the people who are having more struggles with it. So that's the first thing, right? Is getting outside your expertise. The second thing is to think about your discipline in terms of what are the fundamental elements of the discipline. Everybody who knows anything in this room and knows it well recognizes that all disciplines are based on a very small number of very fundamental ideas. Now, all of us know, too, is that the more we learn about a discipline, even though we're learning more and more stuff, we learn that it's based on smaller and smaller number of ideas. Now, when my students watch me give a lecture with no notes and pull things out of the air, seemingly, to them, and talk about things and cite research and do all these kinds of things, and they watch me do this, and some of them, you know, marveling at my intellect, say, my God, how do you remember all that stuff? I couldn't possibly remember all that stuff. Now my response to them is, you're absolutely right. You couldn't possibly remember all that stuff, but it has nothing to do with any inherent limitations in your brain. It has to do with the fact the information in my head is organized in an entirely different way than the information is organized in your head. So when you're introduced to my subject matter anew, you see the discipline as this array of facts and stuff to know. Now, I got the facts too, and I've got the stuff to know too, but all of those facts and all of that stuff is organized around those central principles of the discipline. That stuff and that organization makes all those details not only more memorable to me, more retrievable to me, and actually more generalizable to me in a way that it's not if you're learning each detail at a time. Now, that's consequential for several reasons, the most important of which is the way that organizational structure gets created is typically when memories are going in. Now, that's not typically the way we teach. I mean, typically, if you take whatever 101 for non-majors, you're confronted with all this stuff that you need to remember about the subject that's taught in whatever 101. And with the idea in mind that later on in 102 and 201 and 202, this will all start to be organized. Now, there's a problem with that, and that is the problem of the way the brain organizes information. Typically, and I think this is true even today in many places, but it was very much the prevailing wisdom about the way memory worked for a long time, was that memory in the brain worked like a tape recorder. So you woke up in the morning, record button went down, you went through your day, did your stuff, you went to sleep, stop button gets pressed, you wake up the next day, you want to remember something, you rewind the tape to the place you want to remember, and you play it back, and there's the memory, right? And if you really want to remember something a lot, you do what Karen Carpenter used to do with her vocals. You overdub the tape, and you keep singing over the same thing over and over again. You get a really thick signal on that part of the tape, so when you want to rewind it, you can find that place really easy, and the fidelity is really high. Now, that's a terrible metaphor for memory, for several reasons. The most important of which is the tape in our heads isn't blank. There are no blank spaces on the tape. So if the idea of memory is like a computer hard drive, or a tape on a tape recorder, or a file cabinet, what that presupposes is we get new information, we have to find an empty space for it, you stick it in the empty space, like a hard drive, like a computer will do on a hard drive, with some address, and then you want the information, the computer goes to that address, finds it, and goes and gets it. That's not the way brains work. Brains are inherently association-forming machines. They're pattern-seeking machines. And so when information is presented initially, the first experiences with that information is going to determine, at least initially, where it's going to go and what it gets associated with. And sometimes it's associated in ways that are advantageous for retrieval later on, and sometimes it's not. So the question and the challenge for us as teachers is how do we structure experiences in such a way so that when the information is going in, it's being organized in a way that makes it advantageously retrievable later on. And we'll talk a little bit more about that more specifically in a minute. So one of the things that make these principles kind of cool to talk about is that they are the most intellectually interesting aspects of the subject matter. And I would challenge any teacher that when you're teaching whatever the subject matter happens to be, that every day the bulk of what you're talking about is both intellectually interesting, and that's self-explanatory, and functionally valuable. And by functionally valuable, I don't mean you can make money with it. I mean you can think with it to do something else that someone's not shown you explicitly how to do. Now, that's the key to making all of this work, is presenting information and skills, providing practice opportunities for learners to apply what they learn in ways that they've not explicitly been shown. Is that hard to do? Really hard to do. But it's all centered around one idea. Here's my list of 6 things again. Now, really, I'm going to suggest to you there aren't really 6 things up there. There are really only 4 things, because the 3 that are still highlighted with the green arrow are really one thing. Knowledge of subject matter and instructional goals and the assessment criteria shouldn't be 3 separate things. They should be one thing. Now, typically, when we plan instruction as teachers, we plan instruction chronologically, which is logical enough. So we think, well, what do students need to know first? Okay, let's do that. And what do they need to know second? And then what do they need after that? And what about after that? Now, that makes perfect sense if we had infinite time in which to teach. But, of course, all of us know we don't have infinite time in which to teach. We have all this stuff to teach, and we got this time that we have to teach it in, and there's way more stuff than there is time. So I'll tell you a story that I say to the young faculty and the not so young faculty who are new to Austin, and I will tell them this August too. You know, when I say that about, you know, what to teach and what to put in the class, the thing I said, you know what you ought to be doing? You ought to teach what you like. Teach what's interesting to you. And don't just teach something because it's the next thing in the series of the things that you're supposed to teach. A very good friend of mine who was a colleague here who retired several years ago named John Trimble, brilliant teacher, wonderful writer, probably the best writing teacher I've ever even heard about, let alone known personally, was asked by his department chair 2 years before his retirement, I think this may have triggered his retirement, that to teach his first large class at the university. He used to teach small writing classes, 15 to 20 students, very intensive writing. And his department chair said, okay, Trimble, you won all these teaching awards. You need to teach this large class of 200 sophomores on literature of the American tradition. And we were having a drink one time, and he was complaining and moaning about having to teach this class, and I'm just dreading teaching this class. I said, why do you want to teach this class? He said, Bob, I hate Moby Dick. I said, what are you talking about? He said, I just hate it. It's a horrible book. I hate it. I said, well, don't teach it. He said, well, how can I teach American literature if I don't teach? I said, because you don't like it. You know? And if you don't like it, how are you going to drag these poor students slogging through this book that you can't even get excited about? Right? How's that going to work? The answer is it's not going to work. So teach what you like. Now, I look out at the faces, especially the young assistant professors who are in the audience when I say that, and they say, look, this is my first college job, you know, and as part of my job assignment, I'm supposed to teach 101, whatever my department is. And what's going to happen if I don't teach what the syllabus says I'm supposed to teach in 101, and then the students in my class get to 102, and the department chair is teaching that class, and they don't know something, and he says, who'd you take 101 with? You know, and it's me. And so what I ask them to think about is, you know, no matter what you teach in 101, that's going to happen anyway. So free yourself from the burden of thinking that you're going to teach something, because I promise you, no matter what you teach in 101, you know, some students go up to the professor and say, in 102 and say, didn't you cover this? And the student will say, I've never seen this before. And you spend 3 weeks on it. So forget it. You know, teach what you like. Okay. Now, I know what I'm saying is heresy in many circles. All of this is predicated around the assessment. When I see instructional objectives like students will come to understand whatever, that's a terrible objective. Because the objective is only real when the objective describes what are learners going to do to demonstrate that they understand whatever it is that you think you've just taught them. So really, the idea of, you know, starting with knowledge of subject matter and instructional goals really is impossible without being able to articulate, if you're really thinking about a vision of your students as accomplished learners, what are they going to be like at the end? Given this situation, what are they going to do with that? And again, I add the what are they going to be like rather than what are they going to know, because being a good learner, being an efficient learner, being an effective operator in whatever the discipline happens to be is not only an intellectual thing, it's an attitudinal thing as well, right? I mean, if you bump up against problems and as soon as you bump into the problem, you decide to run the other way, you're not going to get very far in the discipline, whatever it happens to be. So it's not just a matter of knowing stuff, right? It's a matter of having attitudes and ways of thinking about things that allow you to behave in advantageous ways. So I only have 2 points to my talk tonight for all of you who are teachers. And one is, and part of the psych jargon here, learners construct knowledge. We don't give knowledge to people. It's not like, you know, you don't have any knowledge, now I'm going to give you some, and now you've got some because I gave it to you. Learners develop knowledge because of what they do with the information they acquire. So that's what I mean by they construct knowledge. And then the second thing is, which is also important, test, teach. I mean, typically, we think of tests and assessments as culminating activities. You know, you plan instruction, you teach stuff, you're done teaching, and then you give people tests. Right? That's not an effective way to think about that. Because tests teach. Tests teach learners what you think is important about the discipline. And the question I often ask my colleagues on this campus when we talk about teaching and stuff about assessment comes up, I say, imagine a situation where the only thing someone knew about you was the content of your final exam. Would they know what you thought was most important about the subject matter you're teaching? And if the answer is no, well then, why don't you change your final? Right? Now, you might be thinking when you hear me say that, well, it sounds like you're just saying people ought to be teaching for the test, you know? And that's exactly what I'm saying. But, you know, all of us who are teachers in this room, there's no more effective pejorative to hurl at a disrespected colleague than to say, you just teach for the test. But teaching for the test is a bad thing only if the test is a dumb test. Right? If the test, I never get applause in that line. Thank you. Please go ahead. If the test really embodies what's most meaningful and important and substantive about the discipline, and now test is way beyond just a paper and pencil, fill in bubbles or write words or whatever, but doing something, then I would argue all we ought to be doing every day is practicing the test. But the test is the subject matter, right? Not some sampling of stuff that might have something to do with the subject matter at some point later on when you get to your junior year. Okay, so that's what this is about tonight. I brought some data. I'm going to show you a one-semester learning curve for a typical freshman at the University of Texas at Austin. Amount learned is along the y-axis here, and time is running across the x-axis here. Now, there's a lot of things wrong with that. Of course, there's midterms, and there's finals. And one of the things that's wrong with it is, when you're right there, and it's 2:30 in the morning, and the coffee's gone, there's a little crumb of no-dos in the bottom of your bottle there, you know, and you got 3 more chapters to read, and the test is at 8, you know, and you're going through this thing, you're just trying to get all this done, and you turn to a page, and it says in the corner, for further interest, turn to Appendix D. You don't think to yourself, well, my, let me just take a moment and see what that. I got to get through this, right? It's because I got this thing happening, and then I can stop thinking about this, whatever I'm doing. Now, of course, what should be the goal of instruction is to flatten out that curve. And that curve represents a lot of what's wrong with assessment in education. And that is, assessments tend to be low in frequency and high in magnitude. Right? They don't happen often enough, and when they happen, they matter a lot. Now, that goes against a fundamental principle of learning that I'm going to tell to you now. Real learning is a mess. What we've come to value in school is orderliness. And I empathize. If you've got a room with 45 kids in it, I want order. But I got to tell you, learning doesn't happen that way. Learning is a mess. I mean, the state of Texas pays me an exorbitant salary for me to be confused most of the time. And the reason I say that is, one of my jobs here is to figure out things that haven't been figured out yet. That's Jay's job, that's Shelley's job, all of my colleagues, you know, that's our job. That's part of our job. But you don't do that in a linear way. You know, you don't go from A to B to C to D, grant. You know? Or, you know, A to B to C to D, published paper. It's a mess. And that muddle, that fumbling around and trying to figure out where you are and making mistakes and backing up and doing something again, maybe 3 or 4 or 12 times, is the hallmark of coming to understand something deeply. Now, it's possible. It's hard, but it's possible to create that kind of experience in any classroom at any age. And that's what I want to talk about in the next part of the talk. I'm going to start by showing you a film. It's about 2 minutes long. This is from a great film. If some of you who are public school teachers ever want to get this film, it's streamed free by the Annenberg Foundation. It's called Minds of Our Own. And the clip I'm going to show you now is about 2 minutes long. It was a series of questions that were asked at the graduation ceremonies of Harvard and MIT. And I'm going to do my low-tech, high-tech thing again and let you hear what this is.
graduates of Harvard and MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology.
We are the premier engineering and science institution in the world.
No shortage of self-confidence at MIT.
Do you think you could light a bulb with a battery and wire? Do you think you could light a bulb with a battery and wire?
Yeah.
Light a bulb, battery, and a wire. Maybe. Yes. Definitely.
Do you think you can light a bulb with a battery and a wire?
Battery and wire? Well, yes, why not?
Okay.
Definitely.
Okay, can you do that?
The interesting part about the batteries and bulbs question is that people always predict that they can do it. Students say, of course I can do this.
Any hints I should have here?
Teachers say, of course my students can do this.
Ow! Do you know why that didn't work?
I have no idea.
Battery could be dead, the bulb could be bad, I'm hooking it up totally incorrectly. I'm not an electrical engineer, I'm a mechanical engineer. But if I had to guess, I would say it's operator error.
Okay.
I know it's possible, but I don't know how to do it.
It's only after failing that you begin to get upset with the question and think, well, maybe it's a trick question, maybe this has something to do with manipulating the wires. They couldn't hold all the wires together.
You don't have a current if you only have one wire. You need a closed circuit.
But that's not the case.
Oh, well, if I do it with a little light bulb, I just do this. In which case, the light just lights up.
It goes to the fundamental understanding of electricity. If one cannot light a light bulb with a battery and wire, then everything built upon those basic ideas has problems.
I love that film. I just say first, my favorite response to that whole thing is the woman who says, I'm not an electrical engineer. I'm a mechanical engineer. Like, oh, wires, that's another department. We don't have any wires. But what you didn't hear when she was laughing, I mean, when you were laughing, what you didn't hear her say is probably operator error, which is, is engineer speak for it's probably my fault. So she does know that it's her problem. Now, what I'd like you to think about, first of all, they didn't look at for the 6 dullest looking people at graduation to ask this question of. This was a larger experiment. A large number of people were asked a lot of questions like this, and the proportion of people who could answer the question was similar to the proportion in the film who could answer the question. Now, what's telling about that is that I'm sure everyone who's pictured in that film could calculate the voltage in a circuit to many significant digits using integral calculus. And you hand them a battery and a wire and a flashlight bulb, and they say, we didn't have this. Now, the reason that's important is that the teachers who are teaching are making tremendous assumptions about what learners in the room with them are understanding. Knowing that, my conceptualization of what I'm teaching is very clear, and it's deep, and it's far-reaching, and it plugs into places most people don't even imagine who are not in my field. But we ignore the difference between that conceptualization and the conceptualizations of our students at our peril. And so one of the things that we're then challenged to do is how do we create circumstances that reveal the differences between our conceptualizations of what's going on and our students' conceptualizations of what's going on. So to illustrate this, so we're not just kind of laughing at other people, we're going to laugh at ourselves now. I'm going to ask all of you silently to solve this problem in your head. Solve for X. And don't say the answer out loud, just think quietly. Okay, so you want to raise your hand and volunteer an answer? Okay, I have to say, almost no one over 12 years old is raising their hand. Thank you. And I want to make a teaching moment out of that. Thank you. You can put your hands down. Thank you. We'll come to you in just a second. And that's this. Actually, when I asked that of my new colleagues at the university, this is your first talk on teaching lecture, no one raises their hand. I mean, these are people with PhDs. This is like, what, third, fourth grade, fifth grade math, right? Now, I asked my colleagues who were in that room to think about this. When I'm saying, why the heck aren't you raising your hand? And you know what the answer is? The same reason your students aren't raising their hand when you ask a question. Because what if I raise my hand and I said 3/8 and it's not 3/8, and he said it's not 3/8 and I was wrong, then what? Well, then nothing. But all of you recognize that if you did raise your hand and I did call on you and you did say it was 3/8 and I did say you were wrong, that would be the defining event of this week. You would be going to sleep next Monday night, staring at the ceiling going, God, why did I raise my hand on Friday night? Now, I want to suggest to you that that view of error is intensely perverse. Amen. Thanks. You know, I get applause, I get amens. This is a great crowd. But really, what I want to say about this that's important is that, again, there's nothing inherent about human behavior that would lead people to be embarrassed by that error, except the experiences that we've had in school have taught us to avoid error at all costs. And as I said, all of us who work at this institution and institutions like it who do research know that we are much more often wrong than we are right. Being wrong is what teaches us how to be right. No error, no learning. And here's something interesting about the brain. One thing that you can say that is an important thing to think about when you're teaching is that learning is error correction. Now, when I first started teaching, I came up in a very behavioral background. And my thought was, my task as a teacher was to prevent students from making mistakes. It was to obviate error. And I got very good at that, where I could set people up skillfully, carefully. They would get everything right. They'd be so happy. Everybody would be smiling. They'd all get A's. Except the problem with that was, no one was having to confront dissonances between the misperceptions that were already in their thinking and the realities that I was presenting them with. And that's the challenge for all of us as teachers. How do we create situations in such a way that people can, without fear of anything bad happening to them, make mistakes, correct them, and muddle, and become valuing of the muddle? Okay, someone who raised their hand about this? Yes, ma'am. 6/4, that's true. Would you tell me your name? Sydney, thank you so much. Can you tell everybody, Sydney, how you got 6/4? She's got it. You switch? Yep. You said the reciprocal. What a cool word. Okay, so you take the reciprocal. Whoops, I did that wrong, sorry. We're not going to watch that again. Okay, so you take the reciprocal, like that, and you multiply that across, and you get 6/4, right? And if you kept reducing the fraction, you get 1.5, right? Isn't that cool? And you said reciprocal. How cool is that? Now, here's my question. Yeah, thank you, Sydney. Now, here's my question that I want to ask somebody other than Sydney. You know, when you do this question, of course, those of us who have done this way in our distant past, we do remember something about flipping something. And, you know. So, and you do invert the divisor, which is this term in the equation. You take the reciprocal of the divisor, and that's it. So my question to all of you older people is, why do you invert the divisor? See, that's the answer I get when I ask my faculty colleagues. Just crickets. You know, why do you invert the divisor? Nothing, right? And of course, you know, the best answer I ever got for this, I was in a room full of 5th graders once, and I said to these kids, I said, so why do you invert the divisor in that problem? And some kid in the front row said, because if you don't, you get it wrong. What better rationale does a person need than that? You know what? Now, all of you who know about mathematics know that the rationale for inverting the divisor is the only thing interesting about that equation. But I have to tell you, if the goal of instruction on the part of an institution is to teach rooms full of children to get the right value for x, a really effective way to do that is to give people pages and pages and pages of equations that look just like that with different numbers in them, and teach them to chant invert and multiply, invert and multiply, invert and multiply. And they'll get very good at getting the right answer for x. The daunting thing about that is they'll get very good at getting the right answer for x and have no clue about what's going on. But they'll get the right answer. See, that left a little pregnant pause there, didn't it? That was good. Okay. Oh, we're not even going to do that tonight. I'm running out of time. Okay. This next film I'm going to show you is a little bit longer. It's 8 minutes long. And I know I'm getting close to my time here, and Jay's making faces at me. But this is such a cool film, I want you to see it, even if Jay's going to be angry at me. And he'll forgive me, and I'll buy him a beer, and we'll all be over. So this is about 8 minutes long. And this is taken from a very generous physics teacher in Boston who's teaching an honors physics class. And I will just let the film go and speak for itself.
A lot of times you like to think that what you're doing really got across, and a good deal of the time it does, I think. But once in a while, perhaps more than you'd like to think, they miss crucial areas. So there's some things that they didn't quite get as well as you'd like to think that they got them. What Edison came up with was a way of
To demonstrate why explanations sometimes fail, Mr. Carter agreed to let us videotape his lessons.
so that it would last for a while and give a fair amount of light.
Jennifer is one of Mr. Carter's best students. Let's see how well she learns.
So they came up with this little guy, and it's clear so you can see what goes on inside.
Mr. Carter's goal was to explain that to make the bulb light, electricity has to flow through the filament in a cycle, in through the base of the bulb and out the side.
Now, inside the light bulb, basically, enough things to make a complete electrical circuit. If you've got the electricity going in, let's say where the threaded base is, it'll go in through that wire that we looked at, up through the filament doing its trick, and out the base. And that's what, electrical circuits are. They're loops, all right? Okay. There's some wire. I may not have given you enough. I'm going to give you 4 pieces of wire, at least to start with. And I'm going to madly start cutting some other pieces of wire. See if you can come up with a way to get all 3 of them on at once.
Jennifer followed up what she was taught with hands-on activities designed to reinforce the concepts. Jim Carter spent almost a month covering advanced topics in electricity, in addition to batteries and bulbs.
Just remember, it's got to make a circuit. It's got to make a complete loop.
We interviewed Jennifer 1 month after the lesson. Mr. Carter observed the interviews on a monitor in another room.
If you had like a battery and you wanted to hook up the battery to make the light bulb light up, what might you do?
You just need wire connected to the battery and to the light bulb.
Could you draw for me how you would do it?
Jennifer is concerned that without the equipment used in class, the bulb can't light.
You can just show me how you think.
Can I use something to screw the light bulb into?
Why
Just the light bulb itself.
like the thing you use in class, like this thing here? Yeah. Why would you need this part?
I don't know. You can't. It just won't work.
And now here you start twisting there. And why did you do that?
Just to keep the wires in contact with each other.
Okay. Can we try to light up the bulb and see? I'll hold it for you. Okay.
Jennifer didn't light the bulb.
No.
But even more surprising was that the mistakes she made were exactly the same ones she made before the lesson.
And then they'd be both connected to the bottom of the light bulb.
What happens if that wire gets too hot?
Jim Carter's careful explanations had done nothing to change her mind.
The electricity going in.
I'd like you to take a look at it and trace those wires down yourself and examine it carefully. It might be a little sharp on the edges.
Oh, I was wrong. Oh, wait a minute. Well, one of them is connected to the side, to the metal on the outside. Here.
Do you think that's important, that one goes out to the side? Or do you think
Yeah.
Jennifer finally realizes why her previous ideas are wrong and creates a new drawing that is 100% correct.
And one of them to the side. So
you said it wouldn't work last time. What do you think?
I still don't think it'll work, but
Could you draw in what you think you need to add to this to make the light bulb light?
reason, Jennifer still doesn't believe her drawing is correct and insists the bulb can't light without the socket.
I'd like to try out the drawing that you did. I'll hold the light bulb, I'll hold the battery, and you can tell me what to do.
One piece up to each end of the battery.
But before we attach it, then, I want to know whether you think this is going to work or not.
No.
And why do you think it's not going to work?
Because I think you need the, pieces to carry the charge. I don't think it'll work just connecting the wires with the light bulb.
If it did work, then what would you think?
I fall off my chair.
Okay, all right.
It'll work. I don't know, I guess you don't need the little pieces. That's probably just to hold it in.
Now, for all of you who are teachers in this room, your classrooms are filled with Jennifers who are bright, with it, attentive, listening, following instructions, doing what they're asked, and not understanding what you're doing. Now, how do you find them? Not only for you to ferret them out, but how do you reveal to them the gaps in their understanding? And it's a very simple idea, but very hard to execute. And that is, you have to ask people to answer questions that you've not explicitly taught them how to answer. I mean, what school involves right now is I'm your teacher, I'm going to tell you stuff, you write it down. I'll say, when I ask you this, you write down what you just wrote down. Then later I ask you that, you wrote that down. Why would anybody think anyone's understanding is being deepened by that? But one of the reasons that we perpetuate that is because of its lack of ambiguity in terms of assessment. Right? Every one of us who gets evaluated on anything wants to know what's the basis for the evaluation. How am I going to be evaluated? And the more clearly you can tell me when you see this, do that, the happier and calmer I'm going to be. Now, the only problem with that is all the most important and interesting things in the world don't work like that. Right? I mean, that's how you evaluate the trivial aspects of a discipline. To evaluate the deep, meaningful, interesting aspects of the discipline is greatly more ambiguous than that. And that's a challenge that all of us confront every day whenever we design assessments. Now, moving on to my little closing here so Jay doesn't kick me really hard. You know, I had the privilege of working for the past 2 years with the GK-12 program here and working with the fellows. And many of these people who are, all to a person, bright, wonderful scientists, interested, I mean, with it, have very little teaching experience before they get to us. And they're presenting things to young children in schools. And as I was watching them present and watching what was going on in the science classes they were working in, the questions that I asked is, how can I find a quick little quizette that they can use to test themselves to see whether they're actually teaching something interesting or not? You know? And I took the goal from, there's these little magazines that you can, take a quiz to like 12 questions. Are you sexy? And you kind of answer these 12 questions. Right? So this is my little quiz of, are you interesting or not? Okay? But I want to preface the quiz by saying this. Understanding how and why things change is at the heart of science. I mean, the cool thing about science is understanding how and why things change. That's what makes scientists want to do science. Right? It's not labeling things. It's not learning what to call stuff. Now, you might say, well, you can't get to that stuff until you learn what to call stuff. I couldn't more vigorously disagree. And if you have time tonight, I'll demonstrate the falsity of that claim. But, and this other little thing on here, continua are interesting. Dichotomies rarely are. When this variable changes, what happens to this other stuff? When these things change, what happens over here? If we have multiple variables in a system and one of them changes, how do they interact with one another? That is interesting stuff. That was an article in the New York Times just today about the not yet realized promise of genomic typing for populations trying to associate genetic problems with diseases, right? And what they're finding out is there's so much interactivity among genes in all of our bodies that you can't say, well, when you got that one, this is what's going to happen. It's more complicated than that. And that complication is what's interesting. So here's my little quiz. Are you interested? You're not interesting if what's being taught is what to call stuff. And this is not just an elementary school thing or a junior high thing or a high school thing. This is an AP thing. I know people who take AP biology and they can label all the parts of the Krebs cycle. And then I can ask them, so what's all that do? Were we supposed to know that? You know, I can label all the parts, right? Recipes for doing things. You know, I know even on this campus, there are laboratories in this campus where when you take a lab, you do an experiment, and it's got to have a certain result or you don't get credit. Now, how's that an experiment? You know, that's a recipe. You know? Now, you know, no scientist thinks that way. I mean, they're trying to do things to find out stuff that they don't already know. Algorithms. Algorithms are happy things because they lead unambiguously to correct answers. But they also don't deepen someone's understanding of what it is that they're doing. One can follow an algorithm and have no idea what's going on, witness, invert, and multiply. And finally, what questions are not particularly interesting? You know, that's it. Here's the interesting part. Exploring things is interesting. You know, I mean, one of the things that I think Jay taught me this. You know, you kind of, some kid asks a question about something, and you say, well, let's find out. You know, I'm not going to tell you. We're not going to, let's go find out. Let's go out in the woods and play in the dirt. You know, let's watch. How's that water? I don't know, let's break it and see what's inside. You know, and it sounds funny, but that's why all of us became scientists, right? Because you figure stuff out by fooling with it. It's not neat. It's not linear. It's nonlinear, and as I said earlier, it's a mess. Okay. Experimenting when you're really trying to find something out. And I'm gonna close with this one story. And if I convince people not to do this experiment anymore, I think it'd be really good. AISD has a friction kit that you can get from the district. Some of you teachers know this. And basically, it's a plank of wood, about 50 centimeters long. It's got smooth wood on one side. It's got foam on the other side. And it's about friction. And you're supposed to make an inclined plane with this, and it's always comes with a big heavy metal washer. You're supposed to slide the washer down the plane and see that it goes faster on the wood side than it does on the foam side. So one of the great GK-12 fellows I worked with last year, named Roxy Steele, was teaching this lesson to a 7th grade class. So she knew that you're supposed to ask a kind of an interesting, intriguing question in the class, so she walked into class and said, okay, if I had a 50-pound block of cement and I had to push it for 100 yards, would I rather push it along a football field or an ice skating rink? These are 7th graders, right? He said, ice skating rink. And I saw the look on Roxy's face on the videotape. She said, oh, you already know that? And it's something about friction there. So she was going to teach them that. See, they already knew it. So she asked a couple more interesting, intriguing questions that she knows she's supposed to ask. And then we got out the friction kits to do an experiment. Now, the experiment had an experiment sheet that had a hypothesis on it with almost all the words already filled in. My hypothesis is the wood or foam will go faster or slower than the wood or foam. And then there's a space to do 10 replications of the experiment. So kids go off in pairs around the room, they make the inclined planes, they take their washers, and one kid's got a stopwatch, right? So the other kid, they're supposed to do 10 replications on each side. The slide in the washer, 1, 2, and the camera's kind of panning around the room. There's not a look on one kid's face in that room that I think the kid's saying, man, I can't wait to be a scientist. And in fact, what I say to my science colleagues about that, that's not inspiring somebody to be a scientist. That's showing what it's like to be a scientist's least favorite lab assistant. Because that's the experiment that you would be asked to do. Right? So, and explaining things. You know, kids love to know stuff that other people don't know. You know, I mean, I would hope that every kid left the classroom every day not being able to wait to grab somebody by the collar and explain something to them they just learned. You know, I mean, wouldn't that be cool? Okay, so don't hope for that to happen. Teach them to do that, right? Teach them not just to know about something, but actually how to explain something to another human being. Now, that's cool. I mean, if you can explain to somebody why the sky's blue and not some other color? Now that seemed like it'd be such an obvious thing, such a simple thing. Why would you even spend? That's an interesting thing to know because most people don't know that. It's not because the oceans are reflecting off the thing. There are really interesting reasons about diffusion of light and stuff that it's kind of cool to know. And if you know that, you can actually get dates with that. It's really. So rather than this kind of algorithms explaining things to other people, a really powerful thing. And then lastly, how and why replaces what. So rather than saying, this is called this, Richard Feynman, who many of you know, was quite a wonderful character in addition to being a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, one of the great physicists of the 20th century. He was giving a talk at a graduation ceremony once. He was talking about an elementary physics book. And he said, you open this book and there's a picture of a wind-up toy in this book. And the question on the toy says, what makes it move? And you turn the page and it says, energy makes it move. And Feynman said, well, that doesn't tell you anything, right? You might as well say, movability makes it move, I mean, to say the word energy, if you don't know anything about energy and you learn to say energy when somebody says what makes it move, you still don't know anything about energy, right? So the challenge that I leave you with tonight is to think about, not only as a teacher, but as a learner, asking how and why questions beyond the what questions by asking things that have not been shown to you explicitly, by trying to take what you learn and use it in ways that someone's not yet shown you how to do. And doing that reveals things about the depth of your understanding, not only to your teacher and not only to your students, but to you, that motivates you to want to learn. It's an interesting thing to think about. It's really hard to do. And I'm going to remind you something I said at the beginning of my talk, because I'm a musician and we understand recapitulation. None of you have learned anything. If you learn anything about, if that's any effect on you, it's going to have an effect on you when you leave here and you think about this and you talk to somebody about it and you try to make changes in your classroom tomorrow. And that's when the learning will start. This is just the getting ready part. And I could go on, but I can't. So thank you all very much for coming tonight. Great to see you. I've been asked, why do you have to invert and multiply? Actually, I'm not going to take a lot of time to explain it now, but what I will tell you now is that basically when you put two fractions next to each other with that division sign, it's really like having a fraction with each fraction on the top, on the denominator and the numerator of the fraction. So the reason you're inverting is actually you have to get a 1 on the bottom of the fraction. And so if you turn you take the reciprocal of that, you multiply 2 over 1, then it puts a 1 on the bottom of the fraction, and you multiply that times both the top and the bottom, and you get the sentence. That's not an adequate explanation, but we'll do it. I tell you what, stay around and we'll do that on a piece of paper, all right? Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Just so I can
repeat that whole.
Now, yeah. I'm gonna summarize your question, right? And that is, oftentimes there are activities given for homework that are elaborate and have requirements that are pretty specific, and it's not really clear to the learner who's doing it what they're supposed to be getting out of that activity, except going through the activity. Did I summarize that well enough? I'm not sure what I should say about the question of that, but the alternative to that, what you can do as a parent, I think when you're sitting and watching your child do homework and they're doing things, is to ask the very same kind of questions that you just said a moment ago. Is how has your thinking changed between this one and the next one? And after you've done this now at the end, how do you think differently about this than you did when you started at the beginning? You know, I got to tell you, as parents, as caregivers, you know, we're not going to automatically change the way homework is given. Those kind of things. So what we can do that's much more productive than just, you know, saying that's not very effective way to do that is to make it effective, right? By asking questions that are not typically a part of the homework assignment.
Teachers learn that concept. That if, for instance, in math,
Yeah.
if they can do 5 of the same problem,
Yeah.
one after the other, they've learned the concept, so it doesn't make any sense to make them do it 40 times. It only makes them frustrated.
Well, you know, I have to say though, just in defense of teachers who are making assignments like that, teachers are under tremendous pressure to teach students to perform very mechanical operations consistently, accurately. And I empathize with that demand that they have to show that students can reliably produce these answers in whatever kind of specific way. You know, I don't have any solution to that except, like I said, as a parent, I think it's possible for you to ask questions that deepen what your own child has to think about when they're doing the assignment. Yes, sir. Or yes, ma'am.
We live in a world of accountability in terms of schools, and we know that accountability has to be there, or we don't see certain populations served equally.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How do you feel about standardized tests as a way of measuring school accountability?
I don't think the idea that a test is standardized necessarily makes it bad. The problem with testing the way it is now is that if, in fact, you as a teacher are going to be assessed based on how well your students do on this assessment, and the assessment can be taught in an algorithmic way, meaning that I can teach people to follow these steps and they'll perform well on the assessment, it's understandable that you and your principal and the superintendent of your district will all say, this is what we want you to do. Because what we're trying to do is solve for X and get the right answer for X. Now, again, it doesn't have to do with the fact that the test is standardized. It has to do with the test may not measure the things that I'm talking about that are more ambiguous. But one of the things that we know about the kind of tests that we do right now, like the TOEIC test and even the SAT, the GRE, all those kinds of things, is that they're designed the way they are because they're economical to administer. Right? I mean, the kind of assessment that I'm talking about is expensive. It's expensive in terms of time, it's expensive in terms of money, it's expensive in terms of effort. But as long as you want to have one central place where educational assessment is conducted, then it's understandable that we will move to things that seem most efficient and economical, even if that really isn't testing what's most meaningful about what we're doing. And you know, there's interesting data when you look at the national assessments that are given in schools, and you look at states' assessments. It's true in many states that what the states teach kids to do is do better and better on the state's tests. But when you test the kids on things that they've not been taught how to be tested on, you don't see the same kind of improvements often. Not true in every state, but it is true in some states. Yes, sir.
You made the comment that tests teach, and I just got it over a unit. I gave it a test, and my tests are very application-based tests.
Yeah.
And the students did poorly. And is it important? I want to just stop and go back and say, okay, where did you make your mistakes? How do you know, all those questions. But I'm so constrained for time.
Yeah.
Is it more important to go ahead and go back and say, look, because they're frustrated. They just see it in their eyes.
I got it. And so the question was asked, so I gave a test that required application on the part of the learners. And they didn't do well. And they were frustrated because they didn't do well because it wasn't clear about exactly what they were supposed to do when they were asked to do that. Right? And here's the thing. For most all teachers, when students get feedback from a teacher, it's typically associated with a grade. Now, so how do you change that? Well, you give feedback that's not associated with a grade. I mean, often what teachers make the unfortunate mistake of believing that kids will be unmotivated to do anything unless they're going to be graded on it. So what we end up doing is giving assessments as a way of motivating people. And we've all done this in the cheapest way. We will say, okay, there's going to be a quiz on this Friday because, by God, now you're going to read it. Well, now the thing, of course, the problem with doing that is now your demonstration of this information is now associated with a grade. And when we build in grades to every feedback opportunity, we create systematic disincentives for students to accept our criticism. When a student comes to my office because I've given them a B- on paper, I don't give letter grades, but if I did, I give them a B- on paper, and they came to my office hour to talk to me about it. And my agenda in the office hour is to explain to them how they can organize their paragraphs in a way that would more effectively convey the idea they're trying to convey. That's not what they want to hear from me. They want to convince me that the paragraphs are actually better than I think they are, and they want a higher grade. Now, I don't fault them for that. That's an understandable thing. That's the economically logical thing to do. But I just give you one example of what I do in many of my classes. When I have students read things for assignments, when they come in supposedly have read this, I ask them to write about what they've read, both before they come to class and write something extemporaneously in class. Now, not everybody's going to write the same thing, because not everyone will remember the same things about what they've read. That's fine with me. But what I ask them to consider is how differently they would have been reading the same material if I'd said, when you come in on Friday, whatever day it is, I'm going to give you a quiz on this. Because now they're not reading it the same way. Now they're reading every line thinking, what's he going to ask me? Is that something he's going to ask me about? And they've got a highlighter in there. And they're drawing all over the book. I don't want them to do that. I just want them to read. And I'll just say one quick, and that kind of makes this point. A former provost here asked me a long time ago to teach a class for freshmen. He said, I don't care what you teach, just get a bunch of freshmen and do whatever you want with it. So I was teaching a class about inquiry. That was my thing. It was some hoity-toity about the process of inquiry in the arts, humanities, and science or something. But on the syllabus, one of the requirements was you had to read a book that had won a Pulitzer Prize, which didn't have anything to do with the course content. You just had to do that. You had to read a newspaper every day, had to read a book that won a Pulitzer Prize. And so the first night I talked to reading the syllabus. So some kid raised his hand and said, Dr. Newt, will we write a report on the book? I said, no, just read the book. A little pause. Some other kid raised his hand. Dr. Newt, we sign an affidavit that we read the book? Just read the book. Now, it occurred to me, and I'm embarrassed that it took me so long to realize this. All those kids sitting there, really about 60 kids in this room, they've never read a book, except for the purpose of writing a book report. Because why would you read a book? Now, all of us here who read, we recognize that reading is not a solitary activity. Reading is not decoding text, right? We read books for pleasure or interest, and we share them with other people who are readers, right? And we talk to people about them, and we argue about what we think the real point of that was. And so reading just isn't the decoding part. But if that's what we want people to do when they leave school, then we have to build those experiences while they're in school. So my very long answer to your very succinct question is that if you're going to have people assessed in ways that require them to apply what they do, they have to practice that frequently enough when there's not a grade associated with it, that this just becomes the order of the day. And you have to now be accepting of a continuum of correctness. Because most of the students in your class see there are only two kinds of answers. There's the right answer, and then all that other stuff. And there's a lot of stuff that's very reasonable, even though it's wrong, right? And that's creditable. I mean, lots of us come up with ideas that are not right, but they're reasonable and actually even interesting, even though they're wrong. Most kids in school have no conception of that, right? One of my favorite things I ever heard Hans Bethe say, or heard about Hans Bethe saying, he was at some visit lecture, some young upstart put some equation on the board or some radical thing, and Bethe looked at him and said, "That's not even false."
Before we take the question.
Yeah.
Speaking of reading books, Brissinger, we lost and found that someone leave this behind. Come see me afterwards.
That's not part of the talk at all. Yes, ma'am.
Earlier in the part of the first part of the talk,
Uh-huh.
you pointed out that nobody above the age of 12 raised their hand when you asked the over 4 divided by half.
Yeah.
And that's because of people being embarrassed. And that seems to be a natural happening as people grow, they feel more intimidated, and they think every question is an evaluation of themselves. How do you stop that?
Well, I think a lot of it goes goes along with, I assume everybody heard that question because you're sitting at the top of the room, that it goes along with what this gentleman is asking too, right? There have to be multiple opportunities for, if you answer a lot and some of those answers are wrong, the wrong answers are not a big deal. If you answer infrequently, and when you do answer, there's a grade associated with it, then making a mistake is a big deal. I mean, it really does have to do with frequency and magnitude, right? So if you're in situations where you're practicing applying things, and acknowledging the fact, and here's the challenge for anyone who's a public school teacher, acknowledging the fact that not everybody in the room is going to be in the same place at the same time. And you have to start teaching your children that that's fine. This person gets it, this person doesn't get it yet. They may get it next week, and that's fine. But if the grade criteria are set up such a way that everybody better have this by Friday, well, now you've created that same kind of intimidation that you're just talking about, right? It sounds like sometimes when I talk to teacher groups about this, the misperception of what I'm saying is, well, you seem like just lowering standards. I couldn't disagree more. I have the very highest standards, but there's a way to raise standards in a meaningful way, and there's a way to raise standards in a cheap way. The cheap way to raise standards is to just grade harder. I know people who say, boy, I got really high standards. Half my students are failing. I got some really high standards. That doesn't mean high standards, right? You don't have to teach any better. You don't have to get any better materials. You just make it harder to get a good grade. What I'm talking about, having high standards, is being really clear about the fact that all the learners in your class, at some level, can actually express and use what are those underlying fundamental principles of the discipline that you're teaching. And that is having high standards. Yes, sir, you had your hand up a long time ago on the red stripe shirt.
What does the word audacious mean?
Audacious?
Yeah.
It means brazenly bold.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. And you know what? I got to tell you, congratulations for asking that. Because all of us, I'm serious. Because I got to tell you, I don't know how many times I've had conversations with people, and I know, they've used a word that I don't know, and I think I should ask that. And my first thought, for the same reason you're talking about, is that I don't want to do that. Because then they would know I don't know that word. And what students, especially good students, have become very good at is concealing what they don't understand. Right? I get a lot of nods on that one. Yeah, I hear that, brother. Concealing what you don't understand. Because the thing is, to not understand is to think, well, but I'm supposed to understand, right? It is a great thing. So anyway, what's audacious mean? Thank you very much. It's like, when you forget somebody's name, you get introduced to somebody, and then like 20 seconds later, you can't remember what the heck their name is, and then you don't ask them, and when you see them, you go, hi. Just ask. Ask the question. Yes, sir.
Yes, I understand the concept being applied in the hard sciences that we're trying to teach them concepts so that when they go out there, they meet a problem, they run into something, they want to be able to take those concepts, apply them, and figure out the solution by using it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I understand that learning that you're talking about here, but how does that apply to history of 1871?
That's a great question. And I want to tell you something. I think the biggest mistake that we ever made in education was deciding that every piece of information needs to be immediately applicable to solve some real world problem. There's a lot of stuff that I know about that I love knowing about just because it's so interesting. I have no idea whether, I hear students say, they're taking trigonometry, say, when am I going to ever use trigonometry? Well, unless you're going to be a surveyor, probably never. But so what? What's that got to do with it? You can say the same. Did you go to a movie this weekend? Yeah. Well, when are you going to use that movie? Well, you're not. You just went. It was interesting. You don't have to have an application for it.
So my question is, you said it's not learning if we don't go out and use it. So when I go back and do that information, you're saying I'm not learning?
I'm so glad you're challenging me on that. Nice back and forth. By the way, this never happens in school. Typically what happens is student asks a question, brilliant professor lays an answer on, and then I turn to the next questioner, right? This is very good. But what I mean by using it isn't that I use it to solve a problem. The using it might be, I just explain it to somebody else. Right? The using it might be that I notice a relationship between that thing you've taught me and some other thing that I encountered that had nothing to do with you. And I start to notice that relationship. And now that's using it. So using it doesn't necessarily mean in the utilitarian sense, I've made some money with it, I figured out how to fix the plumbing in my house with it. Really, I'm not being flip. Yes, sir.
The time between you were told something and the time when you applied it affect your ability to remember it?
That's a great question. The question was, is the time between you actually encountered something for the first time and the time you actually practiced applying it going to affect your ability to remember it? And the answer is a resounding yes. And the longer that time is, the more that stuff is going to just drift away. Right? And again, you know, listen, we encounter so many things in our life experience, it would be ridiculous for our brain to try to remember everything. Right? I mean, brains are very selective about what gets remembered and what doesn't. And there's a lot of stuff that literally goes in one ear and out the other. Good. But the things that we want to actually make a part of our thinking, back to your terrific question, is to practice. Right? To practice using it. And the practice using it can be as simple as explaining it to another person. Yes, ma'am.
In the concept of public education, we would like kids to be learning, and we want them, as you were saying, we want to be able to apply what you learn, and you want them to be able to ask questions, and you want them to ask questions, you want them to be able to answer, even if it's wrong.
Yep.
Feel like they can. Something that I've discovered in the classroom is that kids frequently don't want to answer questions because they don't want anyone else in the class to know that they're smart enough to either ask them a unique question or to give an answer.
Yep.
Okay, how many teachers in here have had a student that raises their hand and say, they preface everything they say with, I don't know if this is right, but, and it's like, yeah, that's why we're saying it.
Yeah, right.
We don't know if it's right, we want to hear what you have to say. How do you apply this concept of learning to that problem?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I don't have many tips, but here's a tip, right? Kind of like a set of tips. You know, what's hard for a lot of people when they're in an environment that's not entirely comfortable is having to talk off the cuff. So whenever I'm working with students, I mean, even my graduate students, I often have people write before they talk. I mean, I don't even write for like 10 minutes even. I mean, write for 2 minutes. You know, just write down your ideas. Not in beautiful prose, just get them on paper. And then I often have them practice talking to a classmate before they talk out loud. So there's a lot of talking going on. So by the time you're ready to vocalize your idea aloud to the class and to me, you've written it, you've talked to another classmate or maybe a couple classmates about it, and now you might decide that you want to mention something to me. So it changes the tenor of the interaction rather than my saying, so tell me more about that. You know, and what? Wait, I wasn't, I didn't raise my hand. What are you looking at? This guy's scared me, Sydney. Sydney was in another place. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, sorry.
I have a lot of students. I teach science as well as a handful of other subjects. When we review something or have an in-class discussion, some of my kids will raise their hand and say, I have something different. Talk about that. Okay, what do you have? Yeah, you're close. Where? And pull in the ideas of other students. How do we bring our parents into the mindset of just because your student, your brilliant, good-looking students, didn't have the exact wording, their answer was still brilliant, and we're learning together. How do we help our parents understand that just because your kid didn't have it exactly, it still matters, but also to turn to the parents and say, I don't have the, you have to write for 5 minutes, you have to use these vocabulary terms, and here's the exact syllabus because I don't have that.
Yeah.
How do we bring them forward with us in the classroom?
Well, you know, that's a unanswerable question in 2 minutes, but of course I'll try. You know, I think one thing is, first of all, to recognize that what it means to be a really good student. Because all of us who have been good students know that being a good student means you figure out very quickly what teachers want you to do, and you do that consistently. And here's something that I've said to parents many times. In many ways, I would even argue